Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everybody to this new edition of the International Macro History Seminar. Thank you very much to the organizers, especially to Nathan and Rui for all the work organizing this seminar. Thank you for inviting me to chair this session. And I'm very pleased today to introduce you Felix Kersting from Humboldt University. He's going to present his work on welfare reform and repression in an autocracy, Bismarck and the Socialists. I will briefly remind you the rules of engagement. So Felix will have like a maximum of 40 minutes for his presentation, and then we will have like 20 minutes for questions. Please write all your questions in the Q&A. And then I will read them aloud at the end of the presentations. Only if you have some clarification questions during the presentation, please flag it as clarification, and then I will interrupt Felix to ask him about this. I also wanted to remind you that the paper Felix is presenting is available in the website of the seminar. So I think the address is now in the chat, so you can find the address in the chat, the link to download the paper. Also, sorry, I was saying we have 20 minutes for questions. Then after this will be the end of the first part of the seminar. We'll have Bill. This will be 1 hour, and then after this hour, we have another 15 minutes for more informal. The second part of the seminar is going to be more informal for any other questions that have not been answered or any additional questions you may have. So thank you very much, Felix, for being here. And now the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Alfonso. Thanks to the organizers for having me in this seminar. I hope you can hear me well and also see my slides now. I will today present my work called Welfare Reform and Repression in an Autocracy, Bismarck and the Socialists. And to motivate this a bit more broadly, in the current world, 2/3 of the world population actually live in an autocratic country. At the same time, we observe more and more pro-democracy protests. Both of these numbers are based on recent reports from WEDAM. If we look at this constellation, on the one hand, we have this autocratic government who wants to stay in power. On the other hand, we have these protesters who wants to change that. This is, of course, a very central topic in political economy and also economic history. And numerous questions about this constellation have been already asked. Two prominent ones are the following. First of all, how do autocratic rulers react actually to these protests? In influential papers from Acemoglu and Robinson in the 2000s, the idea was that rulers can either democratize, that means they really change the political system, or they can do a reform, i.e. redistributing resources. Other influential empirical work has looked at cases, has looked at the question, when does protest actually lead to democratization? Still, if we look at this constellation between this government and these protesters, there are other open questions in the literature. The first one is, do reforms actually lead to less support for the opposition? So that's kind of the second option in this framework by Acemoglu and Robinson. This would be, of course, if all these reforms are successful, kind of bad news for these protesters, because then in a way their ideas and hopes can be kind of bought off. The second open question is, how does the opposition actually react to these kind of reforms? I think that's also a very important question to better understand their reaction, given that in most of these theoretical frameworks, they are kind of a black box. Both of these questions I try to capture or shed new light on in this paper. And I do so by investigating the following case. I look at Bismarck's policies targeted at the Socialist Party in late 19th century Germany after its unification in 1871. These policies consisted of two parts. First, Bismarck also introduced the social insurance. This was really the first publicly organized and provided social insurance in the world, and also the blueprint for many other states after that. The second part of Bismarck's policies were the anti-socialist laws. These anti-socialist laws were very repressive and led to the ban of basically all socialist organizations in Germany. And I want to look in this paper what were the kind of political effects on the support for the Socialist Party. But before I go into more details onto this, let me sketch you the key competing hypotheses that there are in the literature, especially on the effects of the social reform, of the welfare reform here. First, there's this historical narrative. This is based on the work by historians, for instance, by the famous social historian Wehler in Germany, but you can also find similar arguments in, for instance, Barry Eichengreen's book on populism. And the idea in this historical narrative basically is that the social insurance basically fostered the integration of the working class, and thereby the kind of clear hypothesis would be that the social reform actually leads to declining support for the Socialist Party. The other hypothesis I put forward in this paper is based on this theoretical framework by Acemoglu and Robinson. Here, the idea, as I mentioned on the previous slide, is that rulers can choose between democratization and reform in times of social unrest. And the key mechanism in this framework is this credible commitment mechanism. That means that only if the commitment of the government to the welfare reform is credible, they can actually choose the reform option. And that means, in the context of this constellation between the government and the protesters, that it requires a strong opposition. And exactly this is Bismarck's case is also the example in Acemoglu and Robinson's paper. Then relating this considerations brings me to the second hypothesis here. So social reform should lead to no revolution and rather constant support for the Socialist Party, at least in a new steady state equilibrium, if you will, because then that would indicate that indeed this commitment to the reform is kind of credible, and especially declining support would indicate the opposite. So then it would be not credible. Okay, and what I will do in the first part of the paper is try to test these two hypotheses. To give you an overview of this paper on one slide. So the research question is, how do welfare reform and repression affect the vote share for the Socialist Party? And then the second question is, how did the Socialist Party actually react to the reforms? For the empirical analysis, I rely on a flexible diff-and-diff setup. And I have two key treatment variables that I will also explain in more details later. But to outline the key arguments, so for the anti-socialist law, I collect data on all forbidden socialist organizations in Prussia, and then georeference them, and based on this information, construct the dummy variable whether or not there were forbidden socialist organizations in one constituency. For the social insurance, it's a bit more tricky. Here I face the following empirical challenge. On the one hand, only blue-collar workers were eligible for the social insurance. At the same time, blue-collar workers were the key voters of the Socialist Party. So just looking at the changing correlation between blue-collar workers and votes for the Socialist Party seems not to be sufficient here, because this correlation can change due to very different reasons. For instance, firms can get larger and thereby workers can better coordinate, and maybe that's the reason why this correlation might change over time. But I want to capture the specific aspect of the health, of the social insurance. And here I focus on the key part of the social insurance, namely the health insurance. And I exploit the fact that there were already ex-ante existing health insurances in Germany that then became redundant once Bismarck introduced the publicly organized one. And based on an previously unused firm census, I'm able to calculate the share and then construct this treatment variable, which is all about the share in the population, local population, which got newly insured after the reform. And crucially, I always condition my results then also on flexible effects for the share of blue-collar workers. So that's the key idea of my empirical strategy. What I then find is that the votes, surprisingly, actually increase for the Socialist Party, especially due to the social insurance. Given this finding, then in the last part of the paper, I try to give you some quantitative and qualitative evidence on reasons why this was the case. And here I argue it basically in 3 steps. First, I argue and show that the Socialist Party actually evaded the anti-socialist law. They did so especially by distributing an illegal newspaper. In a way, they reallocated their behavior to the underground, if you will. With this newspaper in at hand, then that's the second part, the Socialist Party was able to reach their voters first and also dominate the narrative about the social reform. And with this dominance, which even Bismarck admitted in the end, they were also able to use a loophole in the social insurance. But before I will go through all of these steps in more detail, let me briefly relate my paper to the existing literature and stress especially the key contributions I want to make with this paper. So I add to this literature, rich literature in political economy of authoritarian regimes. What I add to this literature is a kind of an analysis of a carrot and stick policy and show that the opposition can actually benefit. And what I also add is this analysis of the opposition. And here I argue that dominating the narrative about reform can be seen as a complementarity for the success of reforms from the perspective of the ruler, or unsuccess in this case. So these are the first contributions I want to make. And then, of course, there's this very long-standing literature in history in general, but also economic history in the last couple of years on Bismarck's reform. And especially the quantitative literature has focused on the socio-economic consequences of Bismarck's reform. And this literature, for instance, on the effects on mortality and the like, has shown that there were quite large immediate social benefits due to these reforms. Of course, there's also this historiography around Bismarck's reform, and there are different narratives. For instance, I already mentioned it, that arguably this fostered the social integration of the working class. It was a paradigm for the organization of welfare states in general, and also a prime example for a carrot and stick policy. What I add to all of this is kind of the first quantitative analysis on the political consequences of Bismarck's social policies. Good. So that's the agenda for the remaining 30 or so minutes. So I will give you some more background on Bismarck and the Socialists. I will present, of course, my empirical strategy, show you the effects of the social insurance and the anti-socialist law, before I will talk about the way the Socialist Party organized their oppositional activity, before I will briefly conclude. So we are now in this paper in the 1870s. And in these 1870s in Germany, there was this increasing fears of a socialist revolution triggered, for instance, by the foundation of the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, SAP, by their support for the Paris Commune, and also unseen levels of strike activity in the early 1870s. Due to this, Bismarck reacted quite fast and because he wanted to do something on it. And so he introduced the anti-socialist law, which was targeted at all socialist organizations and also all their newspapers. And then also the social insurance was introduced, and this was targeted at all blue-collar workers. And as I already said, there were quite substantial social effects, for instance, a decline in mortality, higher indirect wages, and the like. So there are reasons to believe that this actually, at least from a socio-economic perspective, was beneficial for the workers. And so it's an open question whether it was also politically, or the open question is whether who got the credits for it in the political spectrum. And the first interesting part here is obviously what were Bismarck's goals. And clearly he wanted to reduce the support for the Socialist Party. On the left, you see a picture of Bismarck, who tries here on this picture to stop a volcanic eruption with this anti-socialist law. And this volcano is called the social democracy here. So he really wants to stop this volcanic eruption. In less metaphoric terms, and in Bismarck's own words, he said with the anti-socialist law that he wanted to fight a war of extermination with laws against the red enemies of the state. So I think that makes it clear that there were clear political motives in Bismarck's policy. With the social insurance, you can argue similarly. Here he said, give the worker the right to work as long as he's healthy, give him care when he's sick. When you do that, then I believe that the gentlemen of the SIP will blow their whistle in vain. So clearly, I think you can argue based on these two quotes that Bismarck's goal was really to reduce the support for the Socialist Party with these policies. Then the next question is, how did the Socialist Party react to this? After the anti-socialist law, there were quite a lot of debates on the right strategy. And some were really in favor of a strong kind of appeasement policy, not to do anything. And then there were the anarchists, Marxists, and they all debated. In the end, kind of the Marxist wing won this debate. And the result was a mix of legal and illegal activities. And that meant also a strong opposition to both parts of Bismarck's reform. A contemporanean later said, we despise the carrot and we break the stick. I show you this quote also because it makes apparent that also already back then, it was about this combination of this carrot and stick, in German called Zuckerbrot and Peitsche. And so the question is, was it successful, or who benefited from this in the election? And now I will present you the way I try to test this empirically. As I already said, for the health insurance, the idea is to exploit local and industry-specific insurance schemes that existed prior to Bismarck's public scheme. And here I basically follow the SPIDE idea that has been numerously used in similar empirical exercises. And the key source I use, I show you on this slide. So this is based on this firm census from 1876. And what it gives me is not only the industry in this column, it also gives me the name of the firm, which I don't use here, but I think it's still interesting. Maybe I will use it later. We have the city, we have the county, we have the number of workers in this particular firm, and we have also information whether or not this firm already provided health insurance. And so you already see here that there's quite some variation also within one industry. And here I show you just a few firms around Berlin. And overall, there were more than 2,000 firms, and I digitized that. And then with this at hand, I'm able to calculate the share of newly insured workers for each constituency in Prussia. I limit my analysis to Prussia because this firm census is only available for Prussia, and other comparable statistics just do not exist for the rest of Imperial Germany. Still, I don't think that's a big problem because Prussia covers 2/3 of Germany, and there's rich variation between rural and urban counties and the like. For the anti-socialist law, I collect data on forbidden socialist organization. And again, I will briefly show you my main source and show you two examples. For instance, a singing club in the city of Dortmund was forbidden. and similarly also Union of Shoemakers in Berlin. This already also shows you that there was quite some, the span was really broad. It was for singing clubs, it was for unions, it was not only for strongly politicized organizations. Okay, with these two kind of treatment variables at hand, I use the following empirical specification. So what I always try to explain is the vote share for the Socialist Party in constituency I at time t, in election t. Overall, there were roughly 228 constituencies in Prussia. And what I also use here in the specification are constituency fixed effects, election fixed effects, and then crucially this interaction between these treatment variables and election dummies. And the key parameter of interest is this gamma t. As I already mentioned in the intro, I also condition these results on this interaction between the share of blue-collar workers in one constituency and election dummies to really make sure to capture the specific effect of the health insurance. In my baseline specification, I also control for the population development to make sure that not the kind of migration flows drive my results. Good. And crucially, this share of blue-collar workers that I forgot is as of 1882. So before the health insurance was implemented. I think that's important because otherwise maybe some selective migration could be an issue here. Okay, so what are the results from this empirical strategy? So the first main finding is about the social insurance. I show this in graphs. The reference year is the last election before the reform in 1881. What you see here with this circle and this vertical line is always the coefficient and its standard confidence interval for each election. And in these boxes, you see the average effect before and after the reform. What you see prior to the reform is very good and reassuring for my empirical strategy. So you see, especially in the last 3 elections prior to Bismarck's reform, basically no difference between constituencies with a higher or lower share of newly insured workers. And this completely changes after the reform, where you see very strong positive and also highly significant effects. These effects are also economically meaningful. To give you one example, between 1881 and 1884, there was a 2 percentage point increase in votes for the Socialist Party on average. An electoral constituency with a 1 standard deviation higher share of newly insured workers would get 1.7.5 percentage points increase for the Socialist Party. That means that it really explains a lot. 1 standard deviation explains a lot of the overall pattern that I observed between 1881 and 1884. Good. For the anti-socialist law, the picture is a bit more mixed, but the structure is again here. The last election before the introduction was 1878, so this is then here the reference year. You see some positive but not significant effects prior to the reform, which I think makes sense because you would expect that there are more votes for the Socialist Party in constituencies where there are also socialist organizations. Afterwards, there's a slight downward trend, but they are quickly able to recover on the pre-trend level. And only in 1890, the coefficient turns even significant and is quite strong, but I'm a bit cautious with this coefficient because in 1890 it was already clear that the anti-socialist law would not be extended, and also the implementation was a bit less strict than before. Good. Crucially, my setting also allows me to look at the interaction between the two treatments here, so between the carrot and the stick. What I do here is then rely on a standard diff and diff specification. In column 3, I show that both coefficients are significant when I include both in one specification. Interestingly, in column 4, then I also include this interaction between both reforms. And what I see here is that there's a highly positive and significant effect for this interaction, and the effect for the socialist organizations in general turn insignificant. And I will come back to this interaction later on, because what's really interesting, or then later also helpful for my mechanisms, is that apparently they particularly gained in constituency where there were already some socialist organizations in the 1870s. Okay, but before I will try to explain you the key mechanisms here, let me show you one key validation exercise I use in this paper. And here I make use of the fact that I have not only spatial variation in terms of newly insured workers, but I also have sectoral variation. And I showed you this also in the sources. And the idea of this exercise here is as follows. So evidence in favor of my empirical strategy would show that industries with a lower share of ex-ante insured workers show the strongest effects after the reform. Because arguably these industries are the ones that are most affected by Bismarck's policy. And I think overall these 10 graphs here also support my argument. For instance, here, always in parentheses, you see the share of ex-ante insured workers. For mining, everyone was insured because that was a century-old tradition in Germany. In clothing or construction and wood, this share was way lower. And so you see the strongest effects for the industries with the lowest share of ex-ante insured workers. The one exception is stones, but this is heavily spatially correlated with mining, and that's the reason why this is maybe one outlier in this figure. I also want you to pay attention to the difference between textiles and clothing, both arguably kind of a bit similar industries. For textiles, we have the share of newly insured workers of about 80%, and in textiles, it's just 40%. And for clothing, we see this strong effect, and for textiles, we see no effect. Okay. Then, of course, I did a bunch of different robustness checks. Let me show you a few. So what I also did is that I added more controls. Again, this flexible interaction, and I looked at 2 other social cleavages in Prussia, one being religion, so this difference between Protestants and Catholics, and also between nationality with the German majority and Polish minority. I can add these social cleavages in column 3, but my coefficients stay basically unchanged. So in column 1, you see the baseline results. What I can also do is I can add province year fixed effects to really also allow for flexible time trends for each province. And again, this basically does not change my results. If anything, they become stronger. And I can also include both in column 4. And again, my results basically do not change either in qualitative or quantitatively. What I also do is I use different sample restrictions. I drop the 25% constituencies that are most affected. In column 6, I only look at I drop the bottom 25% and so forth. I drop the core industrial provinces to really make sure that not a specific region drives my results, but independent what I do, I find highly significant effects, and they are all in magnitudes kind of similar. If you have some more questions on these robustness checks or more suggestions, I'm of course happy to hear them in the Q&A. But let me spend the remaining 10 or so minutes on the last part. So this is really about the way the Socialist Party organized their protest after both reforms were implemented. And the first step is here about the evasion of the stick. And they did so particular with one newspaper. This was called the Social Democrat, in German, der Sozialdemokrat. And here you see on this slide the first issue of this newspaper. And the distribution of this newspaper is in itself highly interesting. They did so from Zurich to Germany and later from London. And within Germany, they relied on a highly complicated and locally organized structure. To give a few examples, they always changed the addresses of all these packages with this newspaper. They always also changed the handwriting. They always used different packages. All of this to make sure that the police is not able to get this newspaper. And what they also did is they relied on this old forbidden infrastructure. So what I can show is that the share of constituencies where there were readers of these newspapers was way higher for constituencies where there were existing socialist organizations in the 1870s, which also speaks to some kind of persistence in protest and this idea of this reallocation from the allowed, from this legal activity to illegal activity. And apparently they were highly successful in doing so. The chief of police in Berlin was in charge of the central supervision of the anti-socialist law in Germany, admitted in internal reports in 1885 that effectively countering this smuggling has proved impossible. And what's really great for me as a kind of also quantitatively working economic historian is that these subscription lists for this newspaper are available in the archive of the guy, Julius Motteler, who was in charge of distributing this newspaper. And this is, I think, really great because normally we don't have any kind of data on illegal activity in an autocratic country because by definition, that's hard to get and maybe even not so smart to document it for the opposition. With this archive at hand, I can then calculate the number of readers in each constituency. You can see that, for instance, in Berlin and in neighboring constituency, we have quite a lot of readers, also in some parts of the rural area and also in northern parts and some central parts of Germany. Okay, but with this newspaper at hand, they were able, that's the next step of my argument, to dominate the narrative. And on the left, you again see a picture from the 1880s. And the man on this picture asked the woman, is it a burden to carry this basket? And this basket is basically the anti-socialist law, but you can also say it's also about the social reform. And the woman answers, no, no, as you can see, I became strong. And I think this exactly this strong position becomes very visible when looking at the narrative about the reform and the discussion about the reform. And so what the Socialist Party did is, first of all, criticizing the shortcomings of the reform and demanding more. They complained about the exclusion of workers in agriculture. They argued that it had too little distributional effects, and they also demanded safer working conditions. They also did is they tried to build on the lack of trust in the government. Here again, they often refer to this quote from Bismarck that the socialist parties were the red enemies of the state. And interestingly, also back then, this is not an argument made by me, but it's really also coming from the sources. So again, in these internal police reports, I find a lot of quotes where the police was really concerned about this lack of trust. And of course, the Socialist Party tried to foster this lack of trust by arguing that this social insurance is pure social demagogy. And still, by combining these two things, criticizing the shortcomings, demanding more, and building upon the lack of trust, they were still able, or they were able, to claim the credits. And this was again admitted by Bismarck himself, who said if there were no social democracy and if not a lot of people were afraid of it, the modest progress we've made so far in social reform would not exist. And similar conclusions I again find in these internal police reports, which were which were collected in an edited volume some years ago. Okay, but I at least want to try to put also some numbers to this argument. So what I use as idea here is that this newspaper is an indicator for the potential dominance of the Socialist Party. Without this newspaper, arguably, it was very hard for the party to reach their potential voters. And so I look again on this interaction effect between my treatment variable on the health insurance and a dummy, whether or not there were some readers of this socialist newspaper. And again, I find a very strong and highly significant interaction effect here. Okay, but given that they were able to exploit that they were able to evade the anti-socialist law and were also able to dominate the narrative, let me now come to the last part. And I think, and here it's also key that that this dominance in the narrative, because in a way that allowed them to exploit the carrot. And they did so by one particular form of health insurance. So there were different forms. Some were organized by firms, one by local public organization, and there were also these mutual health funds, so-called in German Hilfskassen. And workers were free to choose one of them. They only had to choose one. And the advantage of these specific health insurance were that they were independent of the employers. The big disadvantage was that they were only financed by the employees, which was in stark contrast to all other forms of health insurance, which were co-financed by employers and employees. And the Socialist parties wanted to use this health insurance form because they thought of it as a new way to politically organize in times where other ways were basically forbidden due to the anti-socialist law. And so what they did is they tried to promote these health funds. And here you see one part of a brochure by Bebel, the leading socialist politician back then, which is all about how workers should react to this new health insurance law. And in the end, Bebel gives a list of different mutual health funds that the workers should join in their cities. And they also had, I don't know, more than 800 local events to foster this idea, but unfortunately, I don't have data on that. But still, what I can do is I can look whether in districts, that's a unit of analysis larger than constituencies, whether in these districts where we have a large share of workers joining these health funds, whether we see there the strongest effects. And that's indeed the case. And the coefficient for the newly insured, excluding the voluntary workers, or blue-collar workers, excluding the voluntary ones, both turn insignificant. Okay, let me now conclude. What I try to show you in this paper is that the Socialist Party actually benefited from Bismarck's carrot and stick policy. This clearly speaks against the historical narrative on Bismarck's reform. And it's only partially in line with the implications of Acemoglu and Robinson I discussed in the beginning. Of course, we do not see no revolution, which is evidence in favor of the argument. Also no decline in votes, which is kind of evidence in favor of this commitment mechanism idea. However, we do not observe really a stable vote share. Instead, we see this increasing share for the Socialist Party. For the second question, or second part of the paper, I argue that the key ingredients of the response by the Socialist Party were, first of all, this reallocation of activity to the underground, and then secondly, to dominate the narrative about the reform. However, this paper is not able to really address this issue in the long term. I only look at these 8 elections between 1871 and 1890, and one may argue that the social insurance is one of the first examples how reforms actually matter in a capitalist society. And later on, this question of reform or revolution becomes the key dividing point in the revisionism debate that later on divided this the Socialist Party in this more moderate social democrat wing, and the more radical communist wing. But then already Bismarck was that, and now I'm looking forward to your questions, and thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much, Felix. That was great presentation and perfect timing. So thank you so much for this. I can't see questions yet in the Q&A. I remind all participants to please write their questions in the Q&A window. In the meantime, maybe I can start with a couple of things I would like to ask you. So first, I was curious. You said you work a lot on the existence of like private health insurance before the Bismarck reform at usually the firm level. Do you know if the benefits they provided were comparable or similar or better than the benefits of the public system? And if they were, I don't know, if they were maybe better, did the reform mean a worsening for those workers in terms of their health benefits? I don't know if you can speak a little bit about this. The other thing is more general, a little bit beyond your paper, but also you were finally speaking about this in the conclusion. So from your research, should we think that the Bismarck reform policy was a success or was a failure in terms of their objectives? Because finally they wanted to fight the Socialist Party, but they were strengthening it. But at the same time, to the extent that the Socialist Party was kind of assuming the reform as their own, like the outcome of their own work with this narrative argument, maybe they were becoming less revolutionary precisely because of the reform. So was this a success? Was this a failure? And were they? How did the government see the results of the reform? Although you speak a little bit about the perception of the government in the paper. So this would be like my 2 points. One more smaller, the other one more general. I don't know if you want to say something about this.
Yeah, thanks for these great questions. So regarding the existing health insurance prior to Bismarck's reform, so I can't, there's no evidence for every firm, of course, whether they were similar in scope to the public one, but generally they clearly were. And they were kind of also the blueprint for Bismarck's reform. And so I would say that it remained roughly the same. For sure, it was not a decline in the quality of the health insurance. Okay. And then with the success. So that's, I think, a very tricky question, because there are, of course, very different objectives with which you can compare the outcome to. So if it's really about these short-term effects, then it was clearly a failure. But on the other hand, if you look at it from this long-run perspective, then maybe it was a success. So I try to avoid this term failure or success, because there are just so many different objectives you can come up with. And so I would say during Bismarck's reign as Chancellor, he clearly did not achieve what he wanted, and he also admitted that later on. When you look at this long-term issue, then maybe it was a success, because this question was really the key dividing point for the Socialist Party later on in the early 20th century. So that's not a clear-cut answer, but I think it's difficult to answer it, to give one word answer here. The government, yeah, they were concerned with some parts of it. They were concerned with this newspaper. They were concerned with this mutual health insurances. They tried to do something against, but there were some constraints for them. So they needed some majorities in the parliament, and especially some parts of the Liberal Party were skeptic for respect to even stronger anti-socialist laws. And yeah, so they were aware of it, but in the end they had limited room for more maneuver. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I know it's very tricky and complex, but thank you very much. We have here a few questions already in the Q&A. So from Gustavo Leiva, to gain some insights on the results, so the increase in the number of votes, what did the rise in SPD votes concretely achieve around this period? Do you find, and then one more historical question, do you find compelling the idea that maybe Bismarck wanted to gain the SPD support for the Tirpitz naval builds? Yeah, I don't know if you have an answer for this second question.
So what did these increasing votes actually mean? That's a very good question, and I forgot to mention it, that in 1890, actually, the Socialist Party became the strongest party in terms of absolute votes. So they become really, during this time, one of the dominant and leading parties in Germany. Of course, this did not translate into changes in policies because they were never part of the government, but it really strengthened their opposition and their position in general, and also maybe led to this that the anti-socialist laws were not extended and the like. So I think there were clearly some benefits from them. And then with this naval policy thing, that's, I think, later on in the early 20th century. I'm not sure how I should translate it. I think I have to think about this a bit more.
Thank you. From David Mitch, very impressive project. So I still have doubts that perhaps the socialists could have done better if Bismarck had not made these reforms. Also allowing for heterogeneity in working class groups. Along these lines, perhaps the payoff for Bismarck was in retaining support of some core of more moderate blue-collar workers in the longer term. Would you agree with that? Do you have any reaction to this?
Yeah, that's again a very excellent question. Yeah, so it's a difficult question because I then need some other counterfactuals, because obviously just this health insurance was clearly arguably not the best idea because it led to increasing votes. Of course, again, and then this comes back to this question of long-term issues, that maybe thereby the more moderate wing became stronger in the party. But interestingly, at least during the 1880s, and that's the period I'm looking at, the party, if anything, became more radical. So this shift or this divide between reform and revolution really became apparent or stronger in the late 1890s, so 10 years later. And I have a related paper on this with Charlotte Bartels and Nico Wolf, where we really look at this debate. But this was really later. And so I'm not sure, but still there was this intellectual question around whether this party should advocate reform and revolution, and there the social reform was clearly one part of it.
Thank you. From Senalp Canlibel, I'm not sure if you have discussed it. Was there already any significant difference in voting for SPD among the industries with ex-ante health insurance compared to without? I don't know if you can answer that. Yeah.
So what I see is that throughout, I don't find any positive or negative or any kind of interesting pre-trends here. And I think that's reassuring for two reasons, or for one main reason. It also shows that it was not the case that these existing health insurances were introduced because of the strengths of the Socialist Party. I don't find evidence for that, because that would mean to find some differences between these industries. But for those, most of them, the average effect is just close to zero prior to the reform, which I think is very good. So I don't see any kind of trends prior to the reform. For the levels, I would need to check that, but I think interestingly, we don't see any change in the trends prior to the reform for these different industries.
Okay, thank you. So from Emerick Conry, sorry if I mispronounced it. So I'm wondering, while thinking to the question of on the influence of reforms, could we imagine a way to assess the efficiency of reforms creation process? I'm thinking to create a kind of way to assess the process of laws creation by comparing the final and original situation. Would it be an answer to critics of the current law creation process? It's kind of a bit complex, I guess, general question. I don't know if you
I think I would need to think, I think I would need to think a bit longer about this question. I find it interesting, but I don't have a clear answer to it.
Okay, thank you.
That's okay here.
We have a first question here from Tuxen Nurai Saka. I think it was about the sources. Maybe you can explain them again. So how do you find the data to justify your hypothesis, especially about the work groups? Maybe you can go over your sources a little again.
But which part of the sources specifically?
Maybe, I don't know, Tuxe, if you can clarify your question. Speak about the work groups, but I'm not sure about
the work groups.
Yeah.
But which work groups? Maybe I misunderstood. Then I'm sorry, but
yeah, no, I'm not sure about these. Maybe he or she can clarify this. Let's go. The industries, yeah.
This one.
Okay.
This source. I hope it's the right one. And clarify more about how I found it, or what are the interesting. I didn't.
I think it's a question about sources and data construction. So
okay. So what I did here is that I have this firm census, and there are, as I said, more than 2,000 firms in it, and they had to have more than 20 employees. And for the other smaller workshops, I have other data that helps me as well. And so what I do is that I match these firms to the constituencies, to this 228 constituencies that I use in my sample, and then look, just collapse by the amount of workers in one industry that had health insurance or not, and then relate it to the number of blue-collar workers in the same constituency for the same industry. So that's what I do, and I try to explain it a bit longer in the paper for sure, because clearly that's a key variable in my analysis. I hope that helps.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Tuxe. I also I'm curious. So you have the data about the number of forbidden organizations. You don't have an approach to the number of members of these organizations?
No, unfortunately not. So because it just gives me these organizations. What I also do is that I collected kind of a different metric to capture the anti-socialist law by looking at party members that attended a party meeting in 1875 or 6, and then look whether I find similar results. And I clearly find similar results. And there's also some variation, because some of these organizations already dissolved themselves shortly after the reform. And so this is in a way a limitation of the source, but I try to capture it also differently with these party members. And so and then show that the results are basically the same, to really make sure that I can be confident to capture socialist activity as good as possible in the 1870s. Okay. But of course, it would be great to know the number of the size of the organizations. Mm-hmm. But there are some constraints here.
Okay. I don't see. Rui, you have a question? You want to speak up? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Really nice project. So my question, I have one question about the empirics and another about the interpretation. So empirically, if I understand correctly, your first treatment is a continuous variable.
Yes.
So it's tricky to interpret a continuous diff in diff, right? So did you try discretizing your research design, say compare the top quartile to the bottom quartile in terms of this change in insurance coverage? Because there's no untreated population in your research design, right? So it's unclear what you're measuring there. So that's the first one. Then in terms of interpretation, there's this expression. I don't know if it's attributed to Bismarck or someone else, that in Prussia kings make revolutions, right? Maybe we need to reinterpret that in a different way, right? So they sort, your results seem to imply that they provoked the revolution they were trying to contain, right? Because there's this strange positive interaction between the two treatments. So that got me wondering that maybe there's some confounders that that you didn't, or at least I didn't find in my quick reading of your robustness checks. So it's not only that Bismarck was and the chancellors after him were extending this social network, social protection network. It's also that they were also producing social regulation on the labor, on working conditions, on the labor force, on wages, and so on, right? So, and there is evidence, there's data that you could collect on that, and maybe you could say something about that. Then there's also the local conditions of the labor market, right? So there's a bunch of business cycles described in the period you're studying. You could explore the regional variation on those and see whether those perhaps would explain this strange positive association that you find in terms of your chosen treatments on the outcome variable.
Yeah, thanks for this question. So I haven't tried this to make it a kind of discrete variable. I will definitely do that. But in a way, I follow also other approaches here, like the SPIDE idea, and there's also the case that it's kind of a continuous treatment variable. But I see your point, and I should definitely check that. And with the potential confounders, so maybe I can do more, but I think in a way, I accounted for potentially regionally different business cycles by including these province year fixed effects. So thereby I potentially capture that. Although of course I can do it more specifically. And in all these specification, I also include these constituency fixed effects. So I think that also helps me here. But still, I will try to do even more robustness checks to really make sure. But on the other hand, I think I already capture a lot also with these other social cleavages and so forth. Regarding other working laws and so forth, I'm not aware that they really changed during the 1880s. Afterwards, for sure. But I will check again. But I think that was always, quite sure that this was always the key demand the Socialist Party had to really make a kind of working conditions act. But Bismarck really refused this idea, and also the key industrial organizations or employers' organizations also heavily refused that idea. But I will take your point and try to convince you and the reader as good as possible that there are no confounders, and think more about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. I think it's time to finish the first part of the seminar, so this more formal discussion. So thank you to all the participants for being here. I just wanted to remind you that the next seminar will be the last one in this year. Will be on 1 week from now, on the 15th. We'll have here Fabio Brajon, Felix Meyering, and Nick Schauf speaking about inflation and the individual investors' behavior, evidence from the German hyperinflation. So we'll still stay in Germany, but with a different time period. So now we start like the second part with all of you that want to follow the discussion. And maybe we can start with Nathan that raised his hand. So Nathan, if you want to ask Felix your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Felix. It's really a very exciting paper. I mean, it's more a comment rather than a question, but so it's an interesting take on this realpolitik type of thing where Bismarck kind of, if I accept your data, and so basically it's kind of a situation, if you're thinking about game theory, where sort of this outcome is almost inevitable in many ways, because by providing the social security, social health insurance, etc., he's in response to the rising power of the social democrats. He's basically creating the base power because people find that it's effective to vote for them in order to achieve those kind of things. So basically the voters understand that this kind of they're not that stupid, and in some sense he thought it was maybe overly smart, but in fact this is what you would expect from this kind of game, where sort of you're offering some gains to the opposition. You're actually increasing their power because they become more effective. So the voters know that they can get through legislation rather through revolution, more kind of, which obviously even the voters prefer. The cost of revolution are high, not just for the rulers, but also for the people who take place in them. So they would rather achieve these things peacefully. So in some sense, I mean, the only counterfactual is a revolution. I mean, preventing a revolution or something. But in terms of the game, the results are not surprising. If you construct this as a game theory thing, it's as a political game, the results are not that surprising.
Thanks for this take on my results. I think it's really interesting. Yes, maybe I can also add a little bit of theory, even more theory, or really some theory here. I think you are right. On the other hand, I think it's a priori not so clear, because it's always a question when another party tries to steal the topic of another party. For instance, today you could look at the Green parties in all over Europe, and I think it's an open question whether a conservative party can try to steal this topic and then own it. But still, you're right, it's of course a danger. But on the other hand, if we look then at the popular or the historical narrative on Bismarck's reform, and also on this framework from Acemoglu and Robinson, I think that it's not so clear that the Socialist Party should actually benefit from it. But clearly, I think that's how you described it in terms of kind of game theory. That's, I think, also very valuable, and I would try to add that.
So from now on, anyone that wants to ask a question may just raise their hands, and I will open their microphone. And now I think we have a question by Suzette Martinez. So you should, sorry, you should be able to speak. Suzette, something. So you are muted. I think you have permission to talk, but you are muted. Maybe in the meantime we can allow we can listen to David Mitch and David. Yeah,
okay.
Please.
I wanted to ask about rural groups, and particularly I'm thinking of like landed elites, the Junkers and so on. You didn't say much about that. And I was just wondering how they would have figured into sort of Bismarck's calculations. And I don't know much about German politics during this period. Is it possible that they would have played such a role that if Bismarck would have gone too far with reforms, that basically there would have been other factors going on such that basically the outcomes of elections would have simply been sort of overturned by these other more sort of conservative groups? So I was just wondering in general about the role of landed interest in the sort of balance of power in this, in this, the setting you're looking at.
Yeah, thanks for this question. So I think they were largely also in favor of the policies Bismarck did. I think the party party group that were a bit more skeptical in some parts, especially for the anti-socialist law, were the liberal parties. But for the health insurance, for the social insurance, they were clearly in favor, and the conservative parties, and supported Bismarck. And what they also achieved, which was also fine for Bismarck, because basically he was part of these Juncker, that these health insurances and so forth were not eligible for workers in agriculture, and also workers in agriculture were basically not able to strike, form unions and so forth. So I think that's not a big constraint for Bismarck here.
Okay, if I can ask another question myself.
Sure.
In the paper, you have an argument you didn't develop much in the presentation about out-migration.
Yes.
I don't know if you can maybe summarize it, because I found it intriguing, but I didn't completely understand it.
Okay, so the idea with the migration is that there was from 2008 a paper in the JEH from Kudor Kostiras, and he argued that basically the social insurance led to higher indirect wages for Germany relative to the US, and thereby this is a potential reason for more workers to stay in Germany. And this could potentially also be a story, because just less people out-migrate, and that's selective, and so there are more potential workers for the Socialist Party. And I want to rule out this explanation, and I do so by collecting additional data on out-migration from the city of Hamburg. Of course, that's not a complete sample, but it was the key harbor for some parts of Germany next to Bremen. And what I find is that actually, first of all, this decline in share of industrial workers in out-migration started already earlier. And so I think that's not a big concern for me. And I think the key difference to this analysis by Kudor Kostiras is that I have actually data on out-migration by occupation. And thereby I try to rule out this explanation that it's kind of a conflicting story here. And I think it's, of course, it's not perfect because I don't have a complete sample, but at least these figures from Hamburg indicate that it's not an issue. And if anything, we do not see that the number of out-migrating industry workers even sometimes increases. So it shouldn't be really an issue. If anything, it's the opposite. That's the reason I wanted to address that, because obviously it's a related paper to my project.
But how this might have affected your argument about the strengthening of the Socialist Party? Sorry, this is where I'm lost.
Okay, so if it were, less workers out-migrate due to the health insurance, then there's kind of more potential voters for the Socialist Party. I think that was the thing that I wanted to rule out here. but maybe I have to make it clearer. I would try to do that.
Okay, yeah. Now I get it. Thank you. Okay, I don't know if there are any other questions from people in the room. Anyone? I don't see any hands raised. So I think we can stop here. This would be like the end of the second part of the seminar. I wanted to thank Felix very much for the presentation. This was really very interesting. Thank you, Nathan and Rui, for hosting this. And I guess we'll see you 1 week from today. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you for everything, and yeah, see you soon.
Thanks for all these questions and suggestions.
Thanks,
was a
Felix.
Thank you,
pleasure.
Felix.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Felix.
Alfonso.
See you next week.
See you next week.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.
Good. Thanks, Alfonso. It was nice meeting you virtually.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks for the moderation.
Same here, and yeah, very exciting research. Yeah. So hope to see you soon somewhere else.
I would definitely try to come to Groningen for the EIGS next year. Maybe you will also be around. But let's see. Thanks again. I hope it was clear and interesting, and see you soon.
Sure. It was very interesting.
Good.
Okay.
Good. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.